20 years to allow us any concessions into entering into their country or letting them start to stay out of their country. We need side opposition to come and tell us why they're okay with innocent people dying for 20 years and how in those 20 years any sort of diplomacy is going to work. We think it is their burden to show in this debate that their model has a chance of working, that something has changed in status quo aside from eyewash measures which have been given by Assad today. We don't think they've done that. Let's look at 3 questions for this debate. Why intervention will work, why diplomacy won't work, what's the impact of both of these policies. Let's look at why intervention will work, right? Because we told you from the start that military might of NATO, Arab League and Turkey and Qatar combined together are much better than Assad's military might. They even questioned us, does the US and the EU even have any will to go in? We think, why would the US even propose intervening in the Security Council when they didn't have any business going on? The fact is that they're against ground intervention because they want the people of Syria to take ownership of their own country, but ultimately they do want some kind of intervention to take place because they want innocent people to stop dying. It was only Russia and China who was vetoing that in the Security Council, not the US, not the EU. But let's look at that even further, right? Because we think that we recognize that the combined might of these nations are higher than that Assad possesses. So even arms which are given from the US are then enough to go against whatever Assad has. We think that ultimately Turkey and Qatar are then capable of providing whatever ground troops you need, but that's all you need of them, and we don't need them to show that they have that amount of military strength to start with. As long as you have the support of the US and the EU, we think it should be good to them. Go ahead. Ultimately, when they come and oppose it by saying that, look, Syria is an urban center and it's much different from Libya, we think that the US has helped with urban centers in Iraq and Afghanistan to start with. But ultimately, the difference between Iraq and Afghanistan also is that it was much long drawn over there because no local soldiers were ready to fight. We think today the FSA has an incentive to fight, has that local expertise to start with. So they need to come and show us why the Syrian locals won't know their own cities to begin with, won't have that expertise of their own cities to begin with. They never responded to our rebuttal of the idea of defectors. We think that most of these defectors in the Syrian army will come about because they're against Assad. They don't want to kill their own people because most of the ground troops in the army are of the Sunni majority only, and the only reason they're over there is because they're scared that Assad will kill them and that Assad is winning the war. Any sign that the opposition can win the war will give them that hope that they should join their brothers as well in this war against their own country. Which means that the amount of defectors that you get is going to increase under our side, which means that sort of hope for building their own country is then much, much greater. But the last thing we need to look over here in terms of intervention without the UN approval, because we would have loved to have the UN approval even under our side, but we don't think we have the time to wait for it. If Russia and China can't show that support to us, we need to then overrule them, but they never responded to the idea that Russia and China don't want an active conflict with the West itself, which means that they don't come and actively oppose it and actively support Assad in this kind of intervention, which means Assad is left on his own in this kind of a case, and the intervention is going to be short and painless. Let's look at why diplomacy won't work in this kind of a case, because we think that they still have not established what is that inherent incentive for Assad to change. All they told you was trends that are happening in 2011. We think that since March 2011, about 5,000 people have been killed in Syria, and the fact that yesterday there was a massacre in the town of Hawla, and children below the age of 10 were killed in that kind of a conflict, means that Assad really does not want to change. The fact that Kofi Annan has gone into the country today, but he still does not accept the kind of plans that he proposes, means that he does not want to give up that power that he has got within his own country. The fact that some Arab League observers have been allowed and some UN envoys have been sent are no proof to show that the conflict is going to end in this kind of a case. The constitutional reforms that came about in Syria allow Assad to be head of state for the next 14 years, and they want that to allow the country. It doesn't allow people who are in exile to come and stand for elections because you need to have had state in Syria for 10 years. We think they need to contest with these kind of tangible changes which Assad has stopped from happening, and they need to show the kind of incentive that Assad has to change. They haven't necessarily done that. Before I move on, I will not be like your previous speaker, I will take a point.
Alright. Even if there's no outright military conflict, which European nations are going to risk getting energy cut off from Russia? Which nations are going to risk foregoing trade with China?
Okay, it is the EU which has been imposing sanctions in 1979. It is the EU which does not care
the opposition view. Alan,
You have to wonder, if war is as seamless and quick and as painless as affirmative suggests, then why don't we use war as a primary tool to depose dictators? The reason, ladies and gentlemen, that war is not a primary tool is because the entire proof of affirmative bench has been a lie. War is devastating, war is bloody. So when they said that Assad is killing people now, when we have a war, we're going to have Assad and the coalition killing people. That doesn't sound like a very brilliant situation, and you think, ladies and gentlemen, that this is not an alternative we stand for. Because even if they said that the situation with Assad is very difficult right now, they didn't really prove to us conclusively as to why having the coalition there will make anything better. Because they made all of these generic arguments as to why intervention works, without necessarily providing the nuances of what's happening in Syria right now. And that's precisely what Joe gave you from the very beginning of his speech. I'm going to show you later why that is the case. There are three clashes in this debate. Firstly, is it possible to win an intervention? Secondly, can we actually have diplomacy and will it work? And thirdly, how important is a UN mandate? What we need to note, ladies and gentlemen, is that when the previous speaker said that it took 28 years for diplomacy to work in Myanmar, firstly, that is a concession that diplomacy works. But secondly, we actually need to compare outcomes. Because if they gave the situation that the only cases and that the only examples of urban warfare in the recent decade have been Afghanistan and Iran, you need to ask the international community which has actually been a better outcome, Afghanistan and Iran or Myanmar. We think, ladies and gentlemen, if they want to make the case that Afghanistan and Iran and Syria are going to be in parallel situations, they need to explain why Afghanistan and Iraq were actually acceptable consequences for the international community. But actually, the international community has even decided that it has been a terrible outcome that shouldn't be repeated anymore in the future. What precisely did they say under this first idea about the possibility to win an intervention? What we heard coming from the first speaker was a very generic argument. He told us firstly there are better weapons, and secondly there are defections. Firstly, if better weapons make interventions work, then we wouldn't have the debacles of Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. We contend, ladies and gentlemen, that weapons do not determine warfare. That was the argument coming from Job, which we heard no response to. Secondly, we contend, ladies and gentlemen, that defections are not sufficient in the status quo in order to depose the Assad regime. But thirdly, we think that intervention will radicalize people. This was another contention raised by Job, to which we didn't hear any compelling response. Because really, when you have to choose between two people with guns, because you have to realize that both the coalition and both these people who are under Assad will have guns, you need to ask yourself the question, who is easier to vilify? Is it easier to vilify that man who speaks your language, who comes from the same region as you, who probably knows someone who you know, who knows another person? But the point is, ladies and gentlemen, if you compare that to another person who is of white skin, who has a foreign tongue, who you have never seen in your life, who is going to be easier to vilify? Ladies and gentlemen, it's going to be easier to vilify these interventionists, and that's why we believe that if they're backing on defections, their policy of intervention will set back defections. And that's why we believe that their policy of intervention will clearly not work. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, they raise the contention that all of these opposition parties want Assad to go. Okay, brilliant. But the thing is, that's the only thing that they have in common. When you have a lot of opposition groups that have varying interests, precisely about the degrees to which they allow Western intervention, and this was something pointed out by Joe, which again, they didn't clash with. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that's where you make the situation even more ripe for sectarian violence. That's where you make the situation even more divisive than it is right now. So we think that the post-war reconstruction that they're forwarding is not something we want. Before I go on.
Shweta told you that we have ground support in Syria, which we never had in Iraq and Afghanistan. Does that not help quickly end the war?
Well, firstly, I do think they had a lot of ground support in Afghanistan and Iraq, given that there were a lot of troops that were involved in that particular thing. But secondly, we think, ladies and gentlemen, that the presence of ground troops just doesn't mean that you're going to instantly win the war, because obviously that's exactly what happened in Vietnam, and they still ended up losing. We think, ladies and gentlemen, this isn't really a battle of numbers. So given all of the things that Job said about how the centers in conflict in Libya and Syria were massively different, about how there's a fragmented opposition, about how you're going to have a refugee exodus that is going to be instantly unacceptable for many people, and how Job even questioned the willingness of the coalition to actually move forward into this particular fight, we think, ladies and gentlemen, that there's going to be a half-baked effort that will not win anything. Secondly, can we rule out diplomacy with absolute certainty? And the reason why you have to include absolute certainty in this particular regard is because you need to contend that war is a last resort. If they haven't shown us conclusively that diplomacy has failed now and that it will fail for the foreseeable future, then they will lose this debate, and because they haven't proven that diplomacy is shelved. We think, ladies and gentlemen, this was precisely what Peterson gave us in this debate. Peterson told us that there was a rise of market capitalism, wherein we ended the state of emergency in Syria, and wherein we even have trends of the Syrian government becoming even more accommodating and becoming even more progressive by rehiring teachers who wanted to wear their veils. To this, we think, ladies and gentlemen, they had no response. But what you need to understand about this situation is that it is an indicator that the Syrian regime is not as close as they would like to suggest. And even if it is as close as they would like to suggest, we've lived with democracy for much longer. And we gave you the example of Myanmar, again, to which we heard no response. Let's take a look at the third idea. How exactly is a UN mandate going to be important? We heard, ladies and gentlemen, coming from them that we cannot wait for UN approval because China will just veto anything and Russia will just veto everything. Firstly, if Russia and China are opposed to this highly makes their policy suspect, because which major powers will want to oppose China and Russia? Likely it's only going to be the US, it's going to be the UK. So given all of the fatigue that the US and the UK have been sustaining over the years, and the reason why they went to the United Nations is because they want an intervention that is from the United Nations and that is not just from a particular coalition, because even they realize that it's going to be extremely difficult if they just go in there alone. We think, ladies and gentlemen, the only situation which we're going to have are mighty powers who can stand up to Russia and China intervening, and we think, ladies and gentlemen, that simply isn't going to be sufficient. At the end of this day, you need to ask yourself, have they really proven that diplomacy will fail? We think, ladies and gentlemen, they have not, and moreover, they haven't even proven that war will work with absolute certainty. For all these reasons, we think that now is not the time to go to war. We're extremely proud to oppose.
Alan is a 1-year student in mathematics. Right. Now is the session for replies. Teachers, can I have the indication who is going to do the reply for the opposition? Peterson.
11 years ago, George W. Bush waged war in Iraq, and this was one of the worst mistakes that we think have happened in recent history. It seems as though it's so easy for us to forget that when you act by yourself or with a group of nations that neither have legitimacy nor actual strength to produce a better state, that this is something that is ultimately harmful and something that we will come to regret. There are a number of things we need to look at in this debate to ask ourselves which side is being more reasonable. The first question that we asked, and I think it was fair to say that we asked this very early, is who will fight the war that you're talking about? I think part of this motion must ask, or begs the question, that in the event that the UN says no to the war, we must leave it to individual states who are willing to fight the war. We told you a number of reasons why the United States, the EU and NATO and all these other major powers, the only powers actually that have the strength to work with the arguments that they themselves have been raising, we told you there's no incentive for them to fight. Who did they say would fight? They said Turkey would fight. They said Qatar would fight. We think these countries, Mr. Speaker, don't have the military might that they've been arguing, and these countries don't have the incentive to do the post-reconstruction that they've been talking about as well. These countries are less equipped than the United States. These countries are the ones that don't want to antagonize the EU. They don't want to antagonize China. So if the United States failed in Iraq, if the United States failed in Afghanistan, why would Turkey and Qatar suddenly become the shining beacon of change in Syria? We think that this type of analysis is sorely lacking from their side, and that's why we think even if they fought the war, they would not have won the war. But what did we tell you why they will not win the war? There are a number of reasons. For one, that there is no unified opposition. For second, Mr. Speaker, the idea that even if you send soldiers there, there's a lot of anti-West rhetoric. That many of these people don't support one particular group, and you will have a lot of people hating these people entering their state anyway. We think, Mr. Speaker, that these types of analysis have been fairly reasonable, but we think there have been not much responses to these arguments. But the last question we have to ask ourselves is this. Can diplomacy work? It's very hard to tell the future, and oftentimes it's very hard to convince people that waiting in itself is a value. You know, it's like love, it's very difficult. But sometimes, Mr. Speaker, the rewards are worth it, because when you fight these wars, there are a lot of costs, especially when you're fighting in urban centers, especially when you're fighting with a weak military force. These are things, Mr. Speaker, that are harmful. But what did we tell you? We told you there were a number of trends that we can see that, in fact, sanctions or diplomacy has worked. The idea that there are now more rights in Syria as far as religious freedoms are concerned, commerce freedoms are concerned, and so on and so forth. We think there's not been a response to these ideas. Because if we look as to why there are concessions, obviously, Mr. Speaker, it's not because of the coalition of the willing, but because diplomacy has worked at the end of the day. There are a number of things we can analyze this debate, and for this final, what we want to tell you, coming from Ateneo, is the idea, Mr. Speaker, that diplomacy sounds like it's something that is hard to swallow, but it is something that is feasible. And we gave you examples like Myanmar. We gave you examples like these countries to show you the idea that it is a long way, but it is a way that is worthwhile. You ask people on the ground if it's worth it, and we think, Mr. Speaker, they would say yes. But what is their response? No, they took a backseat stance and say, we don't care about what people think, we don't care about what's on the ground. The only thing we really need to know is that if there are enough ground soldiers or what, we're going to win the war regardless of all costs. We think if you look at this does not respond to the reality on the ground that war is a harmful thing, that war in itself is an evil thing. And if you cannot prove that you're going to win the war, or even if you could win the war but you cannot reconstruct the country, we think it's not a worthy decision. For all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose it.
So the reply is
Ateneo never showed why that policy was ever going to work. And when we asked them, the response was, you can't predict the future. We asked them, ladies and gentlemen, give us one example of where your policy has worked. Their answer was Myanmar. Really? Really, Ateneo? Myanmar, which took 20 years and millions of lives lost, ladies and gentlemen? Do we want that to happen in Syria? Again, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think we want that to happen. We gave you an example of Libya, ladies and gentlemen, where our model worked brilliantly. They had no response to the fact that Libya is doing just okay, ladies and gentlemen. We never once took the burden that war is the primary tool. We said we've tried our primary tools, they have failed, it's high time we went in there and saved some civilian lives. That's what I'm doing in this debate. The first logical question is, should we? And their response to that was extremely underwhelming. We said we have a right to protect people on the ground, no response. We said there's an urgent need to save civilians from this brutal killing, ladies and gentlemen, no response. We told you the trends are alarming. The fact that just yesterday, 100 people died in the bombing, ladies and gentlemen, 59 of whom were children. No response, ladies and gentlemen. We think we have to go in, we should go in. The next question then was, will this work? On the first level, ladies and gentlemen, the first question was, are countries willing to intervene? We said yes. Shweta gave you logical analysis. Because if US and EU did not want to intervene, why would they propose something like that in the UN, ladies and gentlemen? Why would they have public statements time and time again about the fact that they are eager to go in and save civilians' lives? The next question was, ladies and gentlemen, what will happen on the ground? Because Because we told you, under our model, ladies and gentlemen, the Free Syrian Army will fight on the ground. They misrepresented our case very badly, ladies and gentlemen, when they said they will follow us on the ground. We never once said they will follow us on the ground. We argued that the Free Syrian Army will do it. We said we will train them in Turkey, ladies and gentlemen. And that's the difference between Afghanistan and Iraq. There were no locals in Iraq and Afghanistan fighting for us, ladies and gentlemen. There were locals in Libya, as opposed to that, ladies and gentlemen. And that was, we think it's very clear this rest outside the house. We told you, ladies and gentlemen, people on the ground want intervention. They desperately want help, ladies and gentlemen. The NTC desperately wants help, ladies and gentlemen. No response from that side of the house. We told you defection. Because we analyzed the incentives as to why people fight for Assad. Because they're afraid, ladies and gentlemen. They're afraid for their families. Once again, no response. We showed, ladies and gentlemen, that we show these people that once there's a likelihood of success, they will defect, ladies and gentlemen. That's why the Free Syrian Army defected in the first place. Last, ladies and gentlemen, we said in terms of capability, we said we were better. We gave you analysis in Rohit's speech why Russia and China won't give their grade A arms to Syria, ladies and gentlemen. No response to that. We told you in my speech why Russia and China have no incentive to engage in active confrontation with the West, ladies and gentlemen. No response to that either. We think that one stands on our side. The next thing, ladies and gentlemen, is will anything else work? The first question, ladies and gentlemen, and again, I bring this up, they never showed incentives Assad has to give up power, ladies and gentlemen, or stop killing. We, on the other hand, showed you why he has incentives to continue killing people. He has enough money, ladies and gentlemen, in his bank to carry on for a year, where without assistance, this movement will fail, ladies and gentlemen. No response to that. That point also stands. Then they said, what about the trends? Shweta told you in her speech that these are an eyewash, ladies and gentlemen, that Assad has in fact modified the constitution to keep him in power for another 14 years and effectively precluded any efficient or effective opposition to him, ladies and gentlemen. No response to that. I don't think that point also stands. Lastly, about China and Russia, ladies and gentlemen, we told you that these countries cannot afford an active conflict. Once again, no response. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, what happens post-conflicts? First issue on refugees, we said in status quo, you will have more refugees. Because if your regime bombs you with tanks, you are going to flee your cities and go to their country. And our country, ladies and gentlemen, there are no tanks involved, there is no air force involved, because we neuter that, ladies and gentlemen, in the initial stages. No response to that either. We said refugees will be less under our paradigm. Last, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of unity, we told you the NTC under our model will reflect the demographics of Syria, ladies and gentlemen. No response to that. We think that will take care of that. We told you, ladies and gentlemen, people on the ground will have ownership of this and will trust the international community because we had timely intervention. No response to that. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been 4 years, but we're finally taking nations back to NTU. Very proud of you.